barbarian. Your comments were actually incorrect and morally indefensible. People's existence and the right to live in the land of Israel predates the Holocaust. Today's political confusion is state past Arab leaders who refuse to accept Jewish people as their neighbors in our historic now that several Arab countries Israel.
Good morning. Sorry? What's wrong? What's wrong? Who needs a pen? Oh. Okay, good morning everyone. So, this is week 7 of this particular series. This is the last one of this series, not the last shiur this term, but the last one of the series. Next week, I'll remind everyone at the end again, but next week I'm going to do a one-off pre-Purim. It's going to be called Leadership Lessons from the Purim Story. Okay, Leadership Lessons from the Purim Story. That's next week, Thursday, and then we'll do probably 2 more after that, after Purim, leading up to Pesach. So we're not finished, but we are doing the last one of the series today. So just a little bit of a review. Last week we were still talking about the relationship between anxiety and how it impacts relationships and what we can do with it. So we talked about the concept that he took it to another level based on the book, and he talked about the idea that we need each other in this world. Relationships are things that we actually need the other person. We talked about the power of a tzibur, of a congregation, of people being together. And he said that people don't talk about it so much because in our society everyone fights for independence, not interdependence. But he said interdependence is more important, and independence is important too, but interdependence is very important and shouldn't be confused with codependence. Codependence means you're needy, you need the other person for everything, you don't contribute. That's bad, that's not a healthy thing, but interdependence is very good. And we explained that concept of needing each other because you value the other person's contribution, of course, is connected with the idea of respect as well. So on the basis of that, we discussed the idea of turning anger into love, the way he puts it, which is first of all acknowledging our vulnerability and our neediness for being part of the relationship. Because when we get annoyed with something, we get annoyed with other people's shortcomings. He talked about the three, I thought it was a very good model. He talked about the three responses, both based on anxiety. Because when we are anxious, when we're faced with a threat, there's the fight or flight. So what happens is when we get anxious, because as he explained, which I thought also was a very important point, that very often anger is a secondary emotion, not a primary one. The primary emotion is anxiety, actually. We get anxious that things aren't going our way, that the person that I thought I was in a relationship was is not exactly the same as I thought it would be, and I'm losing control and all that kind of stuff, right? So very often what happens is everyone becomes anxious and there's a fight response, which isn't good, of course, just flares up. Or fight or flight. So we're fight and the other person is flight, and then they shut down and there's no one to talk to. The worst thing is flight, where everyone just shuts down and then people keep living in the same house, or work in the same space, but there's just no connection, no relationship. So his 3 steps, therefore, was the number one, we need to acknowledge when we get upset about something, we need to acknowledge that it's anxiety is the primary driver of this. Anger is the secondary emotion. We need to do something to initially and urgently calm the anger, like being quiet or just calm the anger, and then express the vulnerability and express the need that we have for the other person, which sets the scene to be much more respectful and much more have a conversation. And although he says it doesn't always work, but it's got a much better chance of improving the relationship. Okay. Before we go on to today, I'll remind everyone, of course, that Sunday a week is Purim, 24th of March, and that we're doing the Purim morning tea at Ariela's Breeder's house, 10:15. Please come along. Okay. Today, I want to just put it all together and add another dimension. In the book is divided into 3 sections. The first section was about learning not to be scared of anxiety, as we explained in the first few sessions. We defined anxiety, how we can use it for our benefit. It's an alert, it's a smoke alarm, it's a misfire of the brain that can actually remind us to get it under control and to live with it and to thrive with it. The second part is what we did the last few weeks, which is using anxiety to actually improve our relationships if we channel it correctly. And then the last section, which I'm not going to go into a few weeks, we're just going to do today, but I'll summarize it a bit and talk about some very fundamental concepts. He calls enhancing spiritual connection. It's interesting. The book is a completely secular book. It's a clinical book on anxiety. The author happens to be a religious Jew, so he kind of tries to frame it at the beginning, and he says, I'll just read it to you. He says, first, in a few general words on spirituality, as I shared in the introduction, spirituality is the search for the sacred, which involves transcending the material world. For many, this involves religion, but for others, it might reflect any aspect of life that is transcendent in some way, such as developing a greater sense of humility, patience, gratitude, kindness, and compassion. Another aspect of spirituality, which we'll discuss in chapter 9, involves recognizing the human capacity for greatness, mustering the courage to face adversity, and pursuing our goals and dreams. So he said, because spirituality can be very broad, he encourages everyone to read the section, but if it doesn't work for you, he says, don't worry, just read the first 2 sections. Okay, anyway, so I wanted to share some points from the section, but also, again, as I said, share and highlight a few fundamental concepts from a Jewish perspective. All right, so he begins with highlighting an aspect of anxiety, which we defined anxiety of fear, right, with fear. Right in the beginning, we talked about the difference between anxiety and stress. That stress is about the mismatch between our expectations and resources, demands and resources, whereas anxiety is more fear of something that we think is going to happen, which is not credible. It's not a credible threat. In other words, it's credible to us because in our mind it's definitely going to happen, or could happen, or might happen, or going to happen. But it's a fear. It's a fear which is we're overreacting to a potential fear, basically, right? But really what that fear is, and this is the point he makes in this section, and we'll talk about this at length, is it's a fear coming from uncertainty. Often what induces the anxiety is that we like to be certain about what's going to happen. And as soon as things look uncertain, that's when we start concocting and our mind goes all over the place thinking about, well, what's this uncertainty going to bring, right? In other words, as soon as we lose the predictability of things perceived to be certain, suddenly then anything can happen. And that's when we start to get anxious and think of all kinds of things that we are afraid of that could happen. And as he says, as I've shared, the chief reason why we are so anxious today is because our cultural intolerance for uncertainty and our inability to withstand any lack of security, right? Because, like we said in the beginning, we live in a society where, number one, we don't like discomfort, and number two, we assume today that everything has to be predictable and controllable, which is a big problem, right? But, he says, this intrinsic relationship between anxiety and uncertainty and uncontrollability can actually be a catalyst for thriving if we channel it right. So again, in line with the book, that we need to take the initial message of anxiety and say, why is this happening? And therefore channel it and reverse it and actually use it as a catalyst for greater strength and greater thriving. So, the Talmud says that, and in this case, in this context as well, the Talmud says, Ein simcha ka'atarat sfekot. There's no greater joy than clarity of doubt, right? We crave certainty. We crave clarity. Okay? What often happens, and we spoke about this a lot during COVID actually, what often happens is that when we get thrust into a world of uncertainty, we fight the uncertainty, which actually you can't do, as we'll soon see, right? Can't fight uncertainty. Rather than shifting our mind and channeling our thought process into a world which is much more certain. But we have to do a lot of hard work to get there, as we'll soon see. Right? And therefore, what we'll see is that one aspect of this anxiety coming from uncertainty is to turn it around and use the uncertainty to actually make us stronger. Okay. Now, just before we do this, a little bit of interesting things that he talks about. He says, what happens with uncertainty and why uncertainty brings anxiety is because since we have an intolerance for uncertainty, we need a coping mechanism. And the number one coping mechanism that people use for uncertainty is worry. It's actually an escape, right? I'm so worried, right? Why are you worried? You can't do anything about it anyways. But because we're so uncertain, and uncertain sort of ruffles us, so we channel the uncertainty into worry, which is anxiety, really, right? He says, as we discussed in chapter 3, worry warts avoid having a truly overpowering and uncomfortable emotional response. They keep their minds busy, thinking superficially about the future they don't need to think about. And deeply uncertain things are in the present. And about how deeply uncertain things are in the present. As a result, the worry reinforces the anxiety instead of alleviating it. Then he says there are other things that people do when they worry and other things people do when they are very, very anxious because they feel so uncertain. Some people start seeking excessive reassurance from other people. It's another response. Some people make long, detailed to-do lists, but sometimes several times each day. Right? They call loved ones repeatedly to make sure that they're okay. Double-checking, such as rereading emails several times before sending to ensure they are perfect. Right? It's not a bad idea, by the way, before you write an email to check it before you send it. And maybe sometimes you can check it twice, but if you're checking it 3 times, you've got a problem, okay? Refusing to delegate work, not allowing others to work not allowing others at work or home to do certain tasks because you cannot be certain it will be done correctly unless you do it yourself. Why is everyone laughing? And there was procrastination or avoidance, right? So these are all ways that we channel essentially our anxiety because of uncertainty. You just need to find where to put it. So we'll check 100 times a day. I mean, we know it's not going to make a difference, right? You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that if you're checking the email for the 7th time, it's going to be the same as the 6th time, right? Or checking up on people is going to make people more safe. It's not. So it's just we find ways where to put our uncertainty. And then what he does is, before we get to the crux of what I want to discuss, really, he talks about 3 options of how we respond to uncertainty, right? So option 1 is to be an ostrich. And some people do this. They hide our heads hide our heads in the sand, pretending that we have certainty. Now, the upside of this approach is that we're calmer, right? Because we don't think about the uncertainty. The downside, of course, is that it's not grounded in reality. So that's an important point. So when we talk about alleviating or or not being so anxious and not letting the anxiety paralyze us, it's not about being in denial. It never is, by the way. We've talked about this with pain, right? Because reality is reality. If someone's unwell, they're unwell. If someone is in danger, they're in danger. If someone has a problem, they're in problem, right? So if a situation is uncertain, it's uncertain. Pretending it's not uncertain, and therefore pretending you don't have anxiety and everything's fine, can lead to possible spikes in anxiety. Like the moments where we suddenly realize actually everything is not fine, we can actually have a much deeper and a much greater, more aggressive anxiety than we had before, right? Option 2 is just to live day to day with the recognition that nothing is ever certain. Okay, so it's not certain, right? Now that's more grounded in reality. The problem is, if we just know and recognize that nothing is ever certain, that if we don't do anything about it, that actually could lead to paralysis, right? It could lead to us not being functional. But there's a third option, and the third option is thriving with anxiety. Right? In other words, as he puts this, to understand that worry is in our mind is our mind's way of reminding us that uncertainty is a part of life. Right? While intolerance of uncertainty leads to anxiety, uncertainty in itself does not need to make us anxious or uncomfortable. It is possible to make your anxiety work for you by recognizing that we are only human and we don't know everything and we don't need to know everything, right? In other words, it's recognizing the uncertainty and then understanding how we can live with a certain degree of comfort with the uncertainty. That's what we need, and that's what it is. Now, how does it all work? So there's a couple of points. First of all, again, it goes back that our anxiety should become a reminder. As soon as we feel anxious, rather than feeling anxious, we should use it as a signal to remind ourselves of the human limitation, right? In other words, it's actually an increase in our humility to know that we are always be uncertain because we don't know the future, right? And then we know that we actually don't need to be certain. Part of life is, it's nice to be certain, it's nice to have certainty, but actually when we acknowledge that life is uncertain, and in fact we discover that we don't need to have certainty, automatically we become less anxious already, right? But of course, on a deeper level, it's not just accepting that things are uncertain and that we are limited, which is part of the humble way of living, to know that we are limited human beings, we don't know everything. But more importantly, the real response to anxiety, and probably the most difficult of all, is giving up control, which none of us like to do. Right? And actually, it's in two parts. So the first part is giving up control. Right? Giving up control is itself an amazing thing. You know, he writes in his book, he has an exercise. He must be a nervous flyer. I'm not going to relate to that. Although it's funny, I still am a bit of a nervous flyer. I'm much better than I used to be. But when I was a very nervous flyer, it actually wasn't because I thought the plane was going to crash or wasn't going to fly properly and all that kind of stuff. It was more like it's going to be late and I'm going to miss my connection and all that kind of stuff, right? But he must be really anxious about flying. So he says, here is exercise that I personally do every time I step onto an airplane. And if you remember from the beginning of the book, this is quite often because he lives in Boston and has a practice in New York. So first, when I enter the threshold from the jet bridge onto the plane, I briefly touch the side of the plane. I then briefly contemplate that within 40 minutes or so, the long aluminium tube that I've just entered will be traveling precariously over 35,000 feet above the surface of the earth at a speed of more than 500 miles per hour. Then as I take my seat, I think of the fact that as a passenger, I have zero control over the plane, from pushback to landing, and at all points in between. Finally, when I fasten my seatbelt, I try to accept that all things that may befall me in the flight are simply beyond the scope of my control, and I relish the experience of letting someone else worry about the plane, and it's not my job to do so. Okay, so that's part one. Giving up control already makes a person less anxious. Realize you're just not in control. So what are you being anxious about, right? So that's true. Because when we relinquish, the pain of losing control becomes less. But there's a part two, and the part two is, I think, particularly from a Jewish perspective, right? And that is not just giving up control, it's giving back control to God. Very different. That's a very much deeper thing, right? So it's giving the control back to Hashem. letting God run the show. Now, it's actually very, very hard to do properly, right? On the other hand, and I've studied this concept for years and then had to apply it in different circumstances when you need to. And the truth is that, and I think this is the point, and I want to talk about this for a little bit, because, it's the concept of bitachon, which we're going to develop a little bit, but it is a very hard thing to do. I think giving up control is one of the hardest things human beings can do. Giving back control to Hashem perhaps is even harder, recognizing that actually He runs the whole show, right? On the other hand, I don't know, in the process of lessening anxiety and worry and fear, I don't know any other way. I don't think it's truly possible unless we can come to a place. I'm not sure what other people do who don't learn about Emunah and Bitachon, but I don't think it's actually truly possible to come to that place of calmness and letting go of the anxiety or making the anxiety work for you unless we understand the principles, not just of giving up control, but giving back control. See, giving up control, like when you go into a plane, means I'm not in control, the pilot is. Well, that doesn't make me hugely more comfortable. It's nice. I don't have to worry about it. Let him worry about it. Who said he's more skilled than? He's certainly more skilled than me. He can drive a plane, and I can't. But I'd have everyone else worrying if I was driving the plane. But okay, it's nice. But it's not. At the end of the day, it's one limited human being giving up control to another limited human being, which is okay, and it's a good step, and it's certainly very helpful. But I think unless we understand the true principles of Emunah and Bitachon, which means not just giving up control to someone else, but giving back control to God, it's very difficult to truly achieve a place of calmness or living with the pain or living with a much more positive way, right? Which is why, by the way, interesting, there was a great sage, his name was Rabbeinu Bachya, I've forgotten his first name, but Ibn Ben Pakula or something, and he wrote a famous book called Shara Bitachon, The Gate of Bitachon, and when you learn it, you see it's not just about Bitachon. In fact, it becomes the foundation of being Jewish. The foundation of serving God is all about Bitachon, really. It's not just about positive thinking and about being calm when things are in trouble and when there's anxiety or pain or threat and something like that. It's actually the foundation of our belief system. And that's why it's such an important work. So let's just revisit some of the concepts sometimes, okay? If God would make a world, this is the complication of Bitachon, and let's understand why it's so hard. If God would have made a world, which He intentionally didn't, but if He would have made a world that He actually just does everything and we don't do anything, it'd be much easier. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. It doesn't mean there will be no anxiety, but I'll give you an example. So when the Jews left Egypt, right, and they went into the desert, so they had this experience where actually God did everything for them for 40 years. They didn't have any food. They got very anxious. God said, don't worry, I'm going to send you food. So He sent the manna down every day. Okay. He still tested their trust in Hashem. In which way? Because He would send it down each day, only enough for that day. That was the deal. Which means you went to bed at night, no food in the house, or in the tent, I should say, right? I'm assuming that after like 3 months or so, they got used to it and they expected it to happen the next day too. But they didn't do anything at all. So yes, it was anxiety inducing because they didn't have food. They ran out of the matzah that they'd taken out of Mitzrayim. They didn't, it wasn't only the manna, it was also the clouds of glory. They cleaned their clothes and miraculously took away the threat of snakes and scorpions and all of that. All true. But they got used to the fact, and it became abundantly clear and obvious that they're not doing any of this, that God is actually in charge. After a while, it becomes a very calm experience. Think of a child, that everything is going well for the child because the parent is just doing everything. So if the child is near the parent, some children, as soon as they go out of the room or the parent can't be seen, they start to cry. But as soon as the parent is there, because the child knows that the parent is there to do everything for them, right? And kind of in a more mature way, that's where the Jewish people were during the desert. Were they sometimes scared if they didn't see God clearly in a figurative sense? Yes, but it was much easier to have the emunah and the bitachon. The problem is that God didn't do that. It's not a problem, it's actually good for us, but the realities, I should say, that God created a world except for those 40 years in the desert. He said that He's still going to give us everything. He's still going to give us our parnassah, sustenance, our health, our successes, our accomplishments, and so on and so forth. But He wants all the blessings to go through the conduit of what we call hishtadlut, meaning what we call now the effort that we put in, right? It's a very interesting thing. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but when we eat bread, we have birkat hamazon, we bench, right? In the original benching, there's 3 blessings. Now there's 4, actually, it was added later, but there was originally 3 blessings. And each blessing was there for a different reason. And the first blessing was actually authored by Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses himself, and it was a benching I did in the desert to thank God for the manna that fell from heaven, right? Now, we don't have manna falling from heaven, and yet we still say that blessing. Why? Because we remind ourselves that we do have manna falling from heaven, just going through the effort that we put in. So we create the conduit, we create what's called in Hasidic terminology, the keli, the vessel, for which God's blessing will come through. But it's all from God, right? Everything we have is from God. That's what we believe. The problem with that model is, not the problem, the difficulty with that model is, that because God said, I'm going to give you, but it needs to go through your hishtadlut, it needs to go through the efforts that you put in, that effort that we put in gives us a false sense of control and accomplishment. Right? But it's a real false sense of control. So we actually think that it was us who made it happen. Which God warns us, by the way, in the Chumash, at the end of the desert experience, when the Jews are about to go into Israel, Moshe Rabbeinu turns to the Jewish people in the name of God and says, listen, be careful. You're going to go into a land. It's going to be a land of milk and honey. You're going to build a life for yourselves. You're going to build batim tovim. You're going to build beautiful houses. You're going to have things grow in your field. And you are going to then turn around and say, Kochi ve'otzem yadi asal li et hachayil hazeh. My own strength, my own power, my own cleverness did all of this. It's going to be difficult. You're going to have the test of falling into a false sense of control. And then when we have a false sense of control, what happens is that when things don't work out, we lose ourselves. We go crazy. We get anxious. Because we think we're controlling the process. Right? So we need to understand the components of how we get to a place where we don't fall into that false sense of control. And that's very difficult because we're all so clever, we're all so skilled, we're all so hardworking. And we create the hishtadlut. Rabbeinu Bachai in his essay on bitachon says that hishtadlut, putting in the effort, is a moral imperative. Right? If you walk into the road and don't look where you're going and don't look if there's cars coming because you say it's all up to God and God does everything, you're actually committing a sin. Right? And in fact, it's like putting yourself in danger, so therefore God will not send you the blessing, and you actually, in fact, might get hit by the car because you didn't look where you're going. Or if you jump into a fire, right? And if you get up in the morning, you don't do anything for the rest of the day, you don't run your life responsibly, you won't get the blessing. But when you get the blessing, it's not your effort, it's God's blessing. That's the difficulty of getting our hand around, because as soon as we do put in the effort, we think, oh, we were clever. I did this deal, I had that meeting, I spoke to this person, I was such a clever person, right? So how do we get through this? The first, we start with some fundamental concepts, right? We talked about this before, but this can never be talked about enough because it's so easy to talk about, makes for a good shir, but it's so hard to live with because we have this false sense of accomplishment, right? And God's in the background sometimes. And we start, first of all, with the very basics of emunah. The basics of faith in God is that everything is behashgacha pratit. Very important. Nothing happens without God allowing it to happen, right? And because of that, it's about absorbing and internalizing the very simple fact, but very difficult thing sometimes to comprehend, that He runs the show every step of the way, and He knows what He's doing. Right? Now, it's hard, because it's hard to absorb sometimes. And by the way, collectively sometimes, not individually, individually and collectively, we get unfortunately reminded once in a while that that is the case, that there's no certainty, that we don't control the process, right? Even though, with all our hishtadlut, right, COVID was a perfect example. We thought we know exactly what we're doing, and suddenly we don't know what we're doing anymore, right? But that's God running that show. Because He allowed COVID to happen, obviously. We thought we'd live healthily, we do what we're supposed to do, and so we should. But doesn't always mean it works out exactly in the direction that because He has other plans, right? So, once in a while we get reminded that. We hope that we don't get reminded in a negative way. We hope we don't get reminded in a painful way. But we get reminded, and we have to have that vulnerability and to acknowledge that we are limited. And that's the first step when we feel anxiety. We should use it rather than get anxious. We use it, there's a reminder. It's a signal that we don't run the show. That's why I'm experiencing uncertainty. I use it as a reminder that I don't run the show and that He does. But there are certain things I need to do. So we have the famous piece of the Talmud that tells us that Hakol b'dei Shemayim chutz v'yiras Shemayim, which means everything is in the hands of heaven except for fear of heaven, as we've talked about many times. Which means that there are certain things we do control, the things that God allows us to control, which is our moral obligations, our spiritual obligations, our moral obligations. So we don't control what someone says to me, but we do control how we respond. We don't control what the day is going to look like, but we do control responsible planning. We get up in the morning and we do hishtadlut. We responsible planning. It's a moral choice. If it's a moral choice, we have control. So we have control in the morning to actually get up and make a proper plan and to do the best that we can and to find the best strategy that we can actually earn a living or whatever we want to accomplish during the day. But that's just what we have control of. Do we have control that it's actually going to happen? Absolutely not. And that's part of getting our head around it. That I did what I was supposed to do, and God gave me the brains maybe to do it, and He gave me the skills to do it, and He gave me the resources to make those moral choices. But He is the one sending us our blessing. And reminding ourselves every day of that, not to fall into the trap that it was me who accomplished what I accomplished. It was me who had that success. It was my cleverness, it was my skill, it was my talent. Yes?
Sorry, I keep thinking about the war and
Yeah, we're going to get to that.
the cheshbon that we're going to make. Is that legit?
Yes, so the cheshbon is also legit. Why? See, it's also right. This is where it becomes very difficult. Thanks for asking it. So, yeah, the failure is exactly the same. So I want to go back to a very simple analogy I think I once gave you, right? Because it takes away the anxiety, it doesn't take away the moral obligation to live responsibly. So if someone breaks into my house, okay, and steals something. So there's two responses that I can or should have. The one response is my emotional response. I'm angry. If I ever catch that thief, that kind of thing, right? And then, of course, what I'm going to do about it. So if I know who it possibly is, I'm going to report it to the police. I'm also going to look at my security system at home. Maybe my locks are not good. Maybe I need to have better locks, right? Now, in our mind, we think the two things go together. They don't. They don't. And that's why it's such a, theologically, it's a very difficult thing to carry together, but it's the only way. It's the absolute truth. And it's the only way we can live and we should live. In order to, unless we want to live with anxiety, of course. But, right? And by the way, this doesn't happen overnight. This is a process. This is the whole life we're working on bitachon and emunah. It's very hard, right? So the truth is, if I get robbed and someone breaks into my house, it was meant to happen. It was meant to happen. Do we know why? No, we don't know why, all this stuff, but it was meant to happen. However, part of my moral obligation is to live responsibly. So my moral obligation now is to check my locks and to report to police so it doesn't happen to everyone else. That's my moral living. Now, I know those two things are very difficult to pull together. It was meant to happen, so why bother? The answer is, because if God wants my house to be broken into, it's going to be broken into. I hope He doesn't, but if He does, it will be broken into whether the locks were good or not. So therefore, it's not my failure that made it happen, but it's my moral responsibility to put in my ishtadlut. So on the ishtadlut level, let's have a look at the locks again, and let's have a look at the security of the house. But from an anger level, there's nothing to be angry about. God knows what He's doing. It's painful. Painful and anger are two different things. He has a piece in the book towards the end, a very nice piece, where he talks about the difference between pain and suffering. Right? We don't want to live with either, but living with pain is not a choice sometimes. Living with suffering is sometimes. It's a very interesting way to put it. Depends how we approach the pain, right? Living with pain is a reality that we all have to face at some stage, and sometimes some people live with prolonged pain and eternal pain. Sometimes there's certain losses that people never get over, whatever the case is, right? So yes, so when someone, God forbid, breaks into my house, it's painful. If I get anxious about it, it means that if now it's going to happen every day, or I get angry with it, or angry with it, all that anger, that's suffering. That means I'm not channeling the pain properly. But that's not a contradiction to then doing the right thing about it, right? Reporting to police, making sure my locks are there. But of course, in recognition everything comes from God, what I would do if someone breaks my house, I also check my mezuzahs to make sure that they're kosher. Because ultimately, that's God's protection. So we've got to, so maybe my mezuzahs are not good. So let's check it. That kind of thing, right? But that's not a contradiction. So, and that's where emunah bitachon comes in. So everything that happened was meant to happen. But it doesn't mean that I can't do more about making things happen in a positive way going forward, because that's what God wants me to do. That's the hishtadlut. And therefore, if that's the hishtadlut, we believe and we're positive that what I do going forward is a keli, becomes the conduit for greater blessing. We're coming to Purim, right? Purim, the Jews were in incredible danger. Incredible danger. Why were they in incredible danger? Because at the time, I'm not sure everyone is aware of the story of Purim in that sense. The threat of Haman against the Jewish people was total annihilation, because Achashverosh, the king, he ruled over the entire inhabited world of the time. So although the Jews were scattered in different provinces, and the Talmud talks about it, there's been other tragedies and persecutions throughout Jewish history, but the silver lining, if there was a silver lining in some of the persecution, was that when Jews were suffering in one place, there were Jews in other places that were more safe. That didn't happen in the Purim story. In the Purim story, there was nowhere to run. Right? And the Talmud asked the following question, how can God let such a threat take place? Did they do something wrong? What was the problem? Right? And the Talmud says something very, very complicated and very difficult to understand. It says, yes, what they did wrong was, at the beginning of the Megillah story, Achashverosh held a banquet. And they went against the advice of Mordechai. They participated in the banquet, and the language is very important here. The Lubavitcher Rebbe once spoke about this language, the nuance. And the language was, Shenehenu, they enjoyed the banquet of Achashverosh. So maybe it was the wrong thing, but it was such a terrible sin. I mean, I could think of much worse sins to be guilty of, right? Okay, they went to the banquet. They weren't supposed to go for whatever reason, but they went. There was immorality there. There was kashrut issues. If they weren't. In fact, according to a lot of midrashim, there wasn't even a kashrut problem. It was Achashverosh was clever. He wanted everyone to come, so he even provided for the Jews with the best hechsher and everything, the whole business. So what was wrong? Well, what's the problem? A waste of time. What was the issue? And he says, actually, the issue was like this. It actually wasn't a punishment. It wasn't a punishment at all. It was a consequence, not a punishment. What does that mean? Which the Jews realized afterwards, right? They actually needed to go to the banquet. It was part of Hishtadlut. It was part of diplomacy. Achashverosh was the king. He was in control. We weren't back in Israel at the time. We didn't have a temple. We were under foreign rule. And when you're under foreign rule, you keep the politicians happy. That's part of what we do, right? Especially if it's a more sort of dictatorship than a democracy, right? So going to the party wasn't the problem. What was the problem? Nehenu, one word. They immersed themselves in it. What does that mean? They thought that was going to be the source of their safety. That was the problem. Was it a legitimate hishtadlut? Yes. But is it the source of your safety? Absolutely not. They thought that's it. That's what they have to do. They have to keep Achashverosh happy. Go to the party. Let's go to the party. What's wrong going to the party? But they put their entire trust in something that they thought they are controlling, the natural hishtadlut of the world. So God says, fine. You want me out of the way? I'll get out of the way. When God's out of the way, it's not very good. And the threat of Haman comes along. Because the threat of Haman was real. Haman was wicked. He was a supreme anti-Semite. He had Ahasuerus wrapped around his little finger. And he could do it. And because he could do it, he was going to do it. Where's God? God said, you kicked me out. You say it's all your control, so then do it. And that's exactly how it turned around. What turned around was, again, you need to do ishtadlut. So what do they do? Mordechai runs to Esther and he says, you're the queen, right? God planted you there. You can do this, right? You need to go and see the king, even though it's dangerous. Try and do something, which is 100% right. What's Esther's reply? Esther's reply is, I'm going to go, but only something else has to happen first. Leich kenos et kol hayudim. Go gather the Jewish people in Shushan. Fast for 3 days. Reconnect. Put your trust in God. Then I'm going to go. I'll create the vessel. But that vessel hasn't worked for us because we believe in that vessel, not as ishtadlut. We believe that vessel is a source of our blessing. So it's not going to help. First, let them reconnect first. First, let them understand where the problem came from in the first place. And she did. And they fasted and they prayed and they reconnected and they realigned the whole thinking and they understood their mistake. Power of prayer. Prayer is very, very powerful, right? And they reconnected and they realigned, and then Vayi bayom hashlishi, on the third day. And she said, and she said to an amazing thing to Mordechai. She said, Gamani, me and my servants also gonna fast. Which is also a question that's asked in the commentaries. Maybe it wasn't such a good idea for her to fast. Because I don't know what you look like after 3 days of fasting when you went to Achashverosh, right? Not having been called there for 30 days, and therefore it was quite an illegal visit, as the Megillah story says, right? But she did it because she knew that's the main source of the blessing. The main source of the blessing is not the hishtadlut that we're going to do. It's important, but that's not the main source of the blessing. The main source of the blessing is our collective reconnection. And therefore she did that. And she says, okay, now we're ready to create a vessel for the blessing to come through. And she went to Achashverosh. Yeah.
But had she acknowledged to Judaism before that? Openly?
No. At that point, Achashverosh, no.
So she's fasting, then she's acknowledging
She's not hungry. No, but I mean, when she went to Achashverosh, until the second banquet, Achashverosh had no idea that she was Jewish. I mean, it was Don't let's undermine the ishtadlut. The strategy was very well thought out. There was one party and then another party, and then there's all kinds of commentaries. Why shouldn't expose Haman the first party, and why should you have to wait for the second party? All kinds of things, right? And also, why did she invite Haman with the party? Was that a good idea? Not a good idea? The Talmud has a whole discussion about it. And there's a piece of the Talmud where the Talmud gives 10 reasons why she invited Haman. And then a fascinating thing happens. One of the great holy sages of the Talmud meets Elijah the prophet, right? It's such a thing where Eliyahu Navi sometimes reveals himself to great tzaddikim. And he says to Eliyahu Navi, maybe you can tell me something. We had this discussion in the Beit Midrash, and we came up with 10 different reasons why strategically Esther invited Haman. But actually, you know what's going on in the world. What was the reason? And Eliyahu Navi says, you were all right. It was all 10 reasons. She was a very carefully thought out strategy, but only after they gave up control. Only after they realized that they don't control the process. Talking about Hashgacha Pratit, it's more than that. Hashgacha Pratit also means, and it's a very comforting thing, that Hashgacha Pratit means that God runs every single detail of the universe. He gives us control in our moral obligations, which is our responsibility. We need to learn the areas that we could control and give up or give him back control. But it's more than that. There are times he does things that don't work out so well, right? But Hashgacha Pratit, the way the commentaries explain Hashgacha Pratit is that God is, and this is the most difficult thing to comprehend, but the most comforting thing. And God says, I am involved in every part of your life, and not only I'm involved from afar, I'm involved intricately with you. As so many times in Tehillim, we read about that Hashem is Atayim Adi, you with me. Imo anachi b'tzara, I'm with you in your suffering, in your pain, in your trouble, in your challenge. God is right there with you. The Talmud says when the Jews went into exile, God went with them. He doesn't abandon us. He never ever abandons us. That's things we don't like sometimes, but He never abandons us. And I think this is so important now. Like we're going through a time collectively where we're in a time where we don't understand what is going on, and it is anxiety inducing. But we have to give up control. We have to know He is running the show. We have to do all the ishtadlut we can. Physically, strategically, great army strategy, good decisions, being proud, not worrying about what the world has to say, all this kind of stuff. And all of us, we have to do our spiritual ishtadlut, which is prayer, which is mitzvot, which is being positive, which is helping soldiers, supporting Israel, whatever the case is, but He is running the show. And He's with us in this trouble. He's not abandoning us. That's part of giving up control, is to know that we give it to You because You doing it, not only You doing it, You're holding our hand. If you can visualize a parent holding the hand of a child, when they're doing something to the child doesn't understand, which happens. Parents do that sometimes, right? They might take a child to a doctor's office or to a dentist and the child is screaming blue murder. But he's comforted by the fact that the mother's holding the hand. He doesn't understand what the mother's doing. He still doesn't understand why the mother's holding him in a dentist chair or in a vaccination office or whatever the case is. Right? But the child doesn't see the picture. We don't see God's plan. We don't see, but He has a plan. He has a bigger picture. So giving up control is very, very difficult. Part of the way we do that is by davening, saying Tehillim, saying Psalms and seeing King David struggle, but yet how he comes to the realization that God is always with him and it's going to be okay and God will take care of him, and it's like the parent telling the child, it's good, I'm with you, don't worry. I'm running the show and I know what to do and you're in my hands, and in my hands is the best place to be. I'm going to alert you because if you really want to know the power of this, sorry Ashley, but last night we had been a beautiful program, a pre-Purim program, called B'Chabatchu. It was much more successful than we thought it was going to be. The place was packed and there were some amazing speakers, including Ashley. Thank you so much, Ashley. And people told their stories. Each speaker, there were 4 speakers. My wife did the introduction and then there were 4 speakers, and it was all about Emunah and Bitachon. We're going to create a link today and we're going to send it out, and I recommend everyone listens to it. Because Ashley in particular spoke last time. I'm not going to do it justice, so please listen to it. I've listened to it 2 times already. It was only for women, so I wasn't here. But I already listened to the recording twice. It was amazingly inspirational, amazingly uplifting. And I think actually one of the things she talked about was, other people talked about the power of prayer, and Ashley talked about giving back control to God. So much of our anger, our anger which is sometimes secondary anxiety because it comes from, as Ashley said it so beautifully last night, hanging on to our own control. And we give back control to God, it doesn't mean that the pain goes away. It doesn't mean the pain goes away, necessarily. It doesn't even mean, although part of bitachon is to really believe that it will turn out okay, but sometimes, for reasons we don't know, the okay that it turns out is a different okay than we thought it was going to be. But giving back control to God puts us in a completely different space. Just giving back that control to Him and say, you run the show. Right? So, the way that works then, going back to the whole process of anxiety, and this is then not just about calming the anxiety and bringing calmness into our life and strength, but actually it's much more than that. Because actually what we need to really understand is that when we do that, not only do we come to a better place, but we come out stronger. See, what's interesting is like this. And this is the point that he makes a bit at the end of the book, but I'm just going to put it into a Jewish perspective. Right? First of all, sometimes we need adversity, unfortunately, to actually become stronger. That's just the way of the world. It's another discussion why, but that's the way it is, right? As we say that when you plant a tree and you put in the kernel of the seed into the ground actually has to, the seed actually has to disintegrate before it can transform into a greater tree. That's just the way it is, right? And here's the paradox of what happens with giving up control. When we give up control and we learn to have emunah b'tzachon, and we give back control, I think more importantly, it is actually recognizing the weakness of the human being. We're recognizing our own frailty, our limitations, that we can't run the show, and we give it back to God. But when we do that, which comes through recognizing our own limitation, our own weakness, we actually become stronger. Because actually we reveal within ourselves infinite potential of strength, of accomplishment, of success, of everything. Why? Because giving back control means, there's a verse in Tehillim, I think it's Tehillim, no, maybe it's Proverbs from King Solomon, where also, it's one of these verses that talk about reconnecting with God, and it says, Hashleich el Hashem yahavcha. Throw your load to God. Right? That's one of the aspects of bitachon. That when you're carrying something very difficult, you're walking around with a big load, right? When you take your load, you say, you know what, God, actually this is not my load, it's yours. I'm throwing you my load, right? I still have the pain, but I don't have the load anymore. But when we do that, first of all, that liberation that we feel inside about that God is with me and He's actually running the show, and I'm in His hands and His embrace, as King David says, Ki atay madi, because you're with me every step of the way. Something else happens. When I give up control and I give it back to God, then all of a sudden I'm running not on my fuel, but I'm running on God's program. And He's infinite. So suddenly I absorb strength to do things I wasn't able to do before. To reach heights I wasn't able to reach before. To even succeed in things I wasn't able to reach before. In other words, what the anxiety should do to us is not just remind us, and this goes back to what we spoke about in the very beginning. What the anxiety should do to us is not just remind us to give up control, not just remind us that God runs the show, there's a munah, shkacha pratit, bitachon, and all these things, but actually should propel us, it should push us to say, you know what, actually I've got an adrenaline, I've got infinite strength deep down in my soul, in the part of my soul that is one with God, that if I just connect to Him and I just let Him run the show and I let Him carry my load and I let Him carry me, then suddenly I'm working on His wings, not on my own. I'm working on His steam, not mine. And suddenly I recognized the limitation and the weakness of my own set of skill sets and my own steam, but now I'm on His frequency. Therefore, I'm actually capable of so much more. Where that's going to take me, exactly how that's going to work out, we have bitachon. What happened till now is His plan. We have bitachon that it will turn out all right. But how long that takes and where exactly it takes us and where the all right will be and what the all right will be, He knows best. It will be all right and will come up stronger and come up better and happier. We hope and we pray not with pain, but sometimes it is with a bit of pain. But whatever it is, will come up stronger, happier, much more capable and much able to achieve much greater things because we've now connected back to Him and we've come back to His embrace and we've come back therefore to His blessing. We continue to do the ishtadlut, we continue to do what we need to do, but it's a completely different perspective and completely different wavelength, completely different mindset. So, coming up to Purim, that's a great sort of preparation of Purim to understand that is one of the great messages of Purim. And that's the story of Esther. We'll keep doing this Ishtadlut, but the Jews reconnected, and suddenly what happened was everything started to turn around, and they actually really became besimcha, they had happiness. But as I've mentioned in previous Shurim, if you look in the verse of the Megillah, when it said that the Jews were happy, right? It says, there's a verse that tells us suddenly how things turned around, and the Jews experienced true happiness. Even though they hadn't won the war yet, by the way, as we've talked about many times. But they had happiness. Why? Because it says, La Yudim Hayta Ora V'Simcha. The Jews had light and happiness. It says light first. Light is clarity. The Talmud says, Ora Zu Torah. Light is the light of the Torah, the clarity of the Torah, the perspective of the Torah. When the Jews experienced Ora, when they discovered light, that's when they had Simcha. That's when they're able to experience true joy. And we have to re-experience the story of Purim ourselves. I know there's still a lot of people that have collective anxiety, which is perfectly legitimate. It is a very, very tough world. We are, in a way, it's so much more painful, but in a way, it's easier to come to this perspective. Why? Because we now know that we can't rely on anyone, not only ourselves. There's no one we can rely on. Right? We are now collectively as a nation at the stage where we are more anxious because we're totally alone. But we need to take that anxiety and turn it around. Because we're totally alone, we know we're actually not dependent on anyone. We are in God's hands. Up until now we thought maybe it's America, maybe it's this one, maybe it's that one. It's no one. It's absolutely no one. But that's great. You know why? Because it's God's plan. We're God's people. It's God's land. And the same thing we do personally. When we rely on other people and we try to control everything, we think it's supposed to happen in certain ways and they don't. And then we realize we turn our perspective, give up control, give back control. We're in His embrace and we become stronger. So that's the end of the series. Just a reminder to everyone, next week we are still doing a pre-Purim shiur on leadership lessons from the Megillah, and then more after that, which I'll brief you. Don't forget, Sunday the 24th. Thank you. Thank you.